Just as a reminder, you can visit us at thepandapod.com. That's thepandapod.com to grab our RSS feed, listen directly, and share PandaPod with your family and friends. You can also reach us directly via email through podcast at thepandapod.com. Thanks for listening.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Panda Pod. I am one of your hosts, Rab, and I'm joined here, of course, today by my friends Jackie
Hi.
and Wiggy,
What up?
and of course Jeff.
Hello.
So it's a full house. And today we are going to be talking about more World War II. And actually,
World War?
yeah, the war's so good that they decided to make it to have a sequel.
Yeah.
And so what I actually want to talk today mostly about is actually the prequel, World War One, because I think that is very important to understanding, why World War Two happened first of all, but also like what happened during it, and and also understand the aftermath. And the reason I personally think that studying World War Two is important is because that is the moment after World War II that the U.S. emerged as a superpower. And at the moment, at the time, right, right after World War II, there were people were still kind of thinking that the British Empire was a superpower a little bit. Obviously, they kind of understood that the Soviet Union was going to be a rising superpower. So there were multiple superpowers at the time, but the one that we're left with today is the United States, and that happened only at the end of World War II. So that's why I feel like it's so important to our modern history to understand the events and what happened there.
Really
Yeah, we
interesting.
were just a bunch of broke farmers. Like that's like that's what we did. Just a bunch of broke farmers and stead holders.
I wouldn't have thought that. Like, I guess that never really popped into my mind, or was never brought to my attention. The idea that it wasn't until World War II that we were a superpower. Like, in my mind, we were already a superpower, and we are like holding off on jumping in, but we had like all of the like gunpowder and manpower just ready to go. But maybe that wasn't the case. I'd like to hear more about this.
Well, I
Yeah,
don't
we
have a
definitely
few
didn't.
notes, but I think we should talk about it since you're interested. The one of the first times the U.S. Ever conquered like territory. That was like the Mexican American War, which is before World War II. And at that point, they were taking land from the Mexican Empire. Obviously, a lot of the U.S. was conquered from native tribes, right? But the Mexican Empire was a Western style state at least. So that was the first time probably that we went to war with one of those, besides Great Britain.
Well, we also have to remember that we pissed off Canada so bad that they came down and burned our White House. So
Right.
What? How do I not know about this? Hold on.
you do
What?
not know about this.
No, I do not. I'm
So
like
that's
a
the war.
history noob. I don't know anything. These episodes are so fun to me.
So that happened in 1812, and basically what happened with that war is that the U.S. kind of got. Essentially they thought maybe that they could, after the Revolutionary War, that they were important enough and powerful enough to start seizing other territory from Great Britain, basically, because Canada is, even today, right? It's part of the British Commonwealth. And so at that time, right, they thought maybe, yeah, let's just go march into Canada and see if we can seize a bunch of it. That was sort of the idea. And actually, it was a lot of it was started because Irish people came over to the U.S. and they thought, oh, okay, well, maybe we can make a colony for ourselves in Canada, like take it from the UK.
Okay. Interesting.
And
Yep,
then they
and
got pissed and marched all the way down and burned the White House.
yeah, the White House did burn to the ground one time, and that was when that happened. And I think with the modern White House is kind of still what they built after the War of 1812.
Yeah, I think they had like, I think all that was left was like the foundation. Like they
Yeah.
built right on top of where the other one burnt down.
Wow. I'm gonna be honest, I don't really know anything about the Mexican American War either. Like, when was that?
So that was not too much longer after that. I'm going to look up exactly where it is because, like I said, I didn't take notes on this.
Yeah.
But let me look up on that one because that is kind of important. That happened from 1846 to 1848.
Okay.
So that would have been right before the Civil War. That was like, I mean, they were kind of still talking about how whether or not there was going to be new slave states and stuff. And obviously, when they seized a bunch of territory out west from Mexico, that kind of made that question a lot more prescient, right? Because, like,
The annexation of Texas is a big one.
yes, yes. Basically, Texas seceded from Mexico, and they decided to annex Texas, and Mexico didn't want to recognize that, and so they went to war and they seized all of like Arizona, New Mexico, California, all from the Mexican Empire.
Oh wow. I'm
So
really shocked that I wasn't aware of this. Like, what was I learning in school?
Well, so I'm gonna spill some beans real quick.
Uh-huh.
You did go to a school that graded you in smiley faces. So
Look, it wasn't smiley faces, it was triangles, squares, and circles. All right.
yeah, like so I don't the faith of that system is pretty low.
And that high school no longer exists. So I mean, it was a failed experiment, and that's all right. I'm still here though, and I feel like I should have learned this at some point. So wow, that's crazy. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense now that you're saying it. Like, we had never really fought another like powerful country.
well, I mean, and that's not entirely true either. I mean, the we fought Spain as well, and this was after the Civil War, I believe. It was, yeah, it was the late 1800s. We had the Spanish American War, where the U.S. Decided to invade Cuba basically to help them, quote unquote, overthrow, like, take off the yoke of Spanish oppression, essentially, right? And actually, for Cuba, that hasn't worked out too bad. I mean, they didn't end up as a U.S. colony. The Philippines, though, was seized from Spain as well as part of that war, and the Philippines got it a lot rougher because they for a long time the Philippines was a U.S. colony, and they were not. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe as far as colonial management, it wasn't too bad, but I mean, colonial management is pretty bad in general.
Gotcha.
And that was not that long right before World War II. I mean, we're talking about a span of 25 years,
Right. The
something like
Spanish
that. Like
American
this
War,
is 1890s.
it was
Um,
1898.
yeah.
So, I mean, that was not it wasn't those there were definitely some the Spanish American War veterans who would have been, like, leading and stuff like that in the in World War 1.
Yeah,
Wow.
and Cuba actually did really well because that's shortly shortly after that time is when a lot of our um like celebrities started going down there and being and like that's when Cuba really started getting its reputation. Like Frank Sinatra and all of them going down to Cuba and smoking Cuban cigars and gambling and all that kinds of stuff because it used to be America's Vegas
Right, right.
for like 40 years.
Huh.
So,
I forget how young our country really is.
oh yeah, we're so young. We're
Yeah.
so young. It- yeah, and I think this is a good segue into Rab's commentary on World War I.
Yeah,
Yeah, sure.
I've distracted us enough here. Let's continue.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. I mean, I think if you guys have actual questions about stuff, I mean, even if I got to go look it up, right? I think it's
Yeah.
worth exploring actual questions, even if they aren't in my notes.
Well,
Well, I don't
I'm not
know.
gonna not ask them. You're gonna hear my questions for sure. So.
Yeah, I think a good thing to remember is like I don't know how many young listeners we have, but we also don't know what's being taught in schools over the past like 20 years. Like what do they teach now?
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
who knows what they teach now, right?
We
Like
should
how
definitely
far
have
into
an
history?
episode on education at some point.
Oh, that's a good.
Like I can
Oh,
talk
oh, for
about my
sure.
crazy schooling experience, and we can talk about like what the hell is going on with schools today. Like, wow, I've read an article the other day about like literacy in Gen A, and it is scary.
Yeah, yeah.
I know that's not really relevant to this conversation, but we should be talking about that at some point.
Well,
Which gen is
have my
Gen
mom
8?
on for that episode.
The youngest generation right now, Gen Alpha.
Oh, okay. Is
Yeah.
that like my son's generation?
Yes.
He's A. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
My
he's
8 year
alpha
old.
because that's after Z, right? They had to
Right.
have somewhere to go after Z.
So
Mhm.
my
And that's
8
not
year
to be
old.
confused with Gen A from Forrest Gump. I just needed
Correct.
to.
Correct. Yeah.
Gen A.
Gen A. Although, from what I read, they kind of sound like that. Gen A.
What are you learning in school, Jen A?
So what is the generation between not us? Oh, what is the generation of current 17-year-olds?
Zoomers, right?
That would be like the tail end of the Zoomer age. Yeah.
I have so many questions
I don't even know.
that we can talk
Gen
about at a
Z.
later time. But
Yeah.
Jesus Christ. Okay, good.
What
Anyway,
we've learned from
World
this
War
once
II.
again,
World War II.
what we've learned from this once again is that we're old as fuck,
And that
and we did,
none of
and
us are
we
experts
don't
in
know.
anything.
None of us are experts in anything, and we don't know when it actually happened because I still feel like I just turned 39, and I still feel 30. Like I don't understand. My mind isn't any older. Sure as fuck haven't learned anything new.
Well, speaking of things that are old as fuck and we don't know when they actually happened, let's discuss some history.
World War II.
World War II.
So anyways, I like I said, I kind of want to I feel like to understand history, you kind of have to understand the context that it happened in, right? So that's why I think it's worth spending time on things like the Spanish American War. But last time we kind of gave like a broad outline of the beginning of World War II. So I want to go even further back and kind of zoom in on the beginning of the beginning, which is World War One. And a lot of people see it this way, and I do as well, which is that World War One and World War Two are kind of the same war with an 18-year truce in them.
Yeah,
Yeah, just
for
like a
sure.
really long ceasefire.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And even the combatants are pretty much like it's the same, chuckleheads on both sides. I mean, in World War Two, sorry, in World War One, the Allies had Italy on their side, but at that point, Italy was less than 100 years old. I mean, they were basically just formed, so they were nearly. Yeah, Italy has not been around for long. At least the modern Italian state.
Yeah, the Roman Empire split into multiple parts, and it wasn't until about that time when they coalesced into the one Italy state with Rome being
Yeah,
its own thing.
Italy formed the modern Italy state. It unified in 1861, and it became a republic in 1946, which is at the end of World War II. So yeah, there's a through line from 1861 to 1946 of like the Italian kingdom slash empire. Mussolini, when he was ruling it, it was the Italian Empire. But I mean that's a less than 100-year period. Before that, Italy was basically just like a collection of city states.
Wow. Okay.
So like when you hear about like the history of Venice or like Genoa or like Rome or something like that, I mean obviously Rome's a little different, but those cities, they had their own like kind of stories and what have you, but they weren't really a thing until the mid late 1800s.
Yeah, Venetia was its own like area.
Right. So yeah. Anyways, also it's the case that in World War One, the Axis had Austria-Hungary, and Austria-Hungary actually controlled a lot of what became modern Italy. So I mean, at the height of Austria's power, they controlled like a lot of North Italy. So that's part of the reason that Italy is so new and so weak here is because of the fact that Austria literally just had a lot of what we consider Italy as part of their empire. And yeah, so Austria was on the side of the Axis in World War II, or sorry, in World War One, which I mean, it's called the Central Powers in World War One, but I'm calling it Axis powers since this is a World War II discussion. And so Austria-Hungary was on the Central Powers / Axis side, and most of Austria-Hungary like that empire ended at the end of World War One. But Austria was absorbed into Germany right at the beginning of World War II. Hungary was on the Axis side. Croatia and Romania, they were both part of Austria-Hungary, and they were on the Axis side as well. Bulgaria, some of Bulgaria was part of Austria-Hungary and also on the Axis side. So I mean, it's like you kind of get the same peoples, even if you don't get the same nations, right?
Gotcha. Okay.
Also in World War One, the Central Powers had the Ottomans, who at the end, they didn't exist by the time of World War Two. The World War One basically ended that empire as well.
How? That's not relevant. Never mind.
So anyways, the major powers that were on the same side in both wars are France, UK, US, Russia, Germany, and Bulgaria. Anyways, to kind of zoom in even further, I want to talk about the histories of particular countries. Because, and when I say histories, I mean the periods leading up to World War One through World War One and after, like during the interim between World War One and World War Two. And I have these divided into a couple of categories. And I'm going to start with Germany and Russia because I think that they're really important. And I intend that if next time we do a World War Two, really focused on World War One, we'll probably come back to France, UK, and US because I kind of see those as one block. And then the third block I have in here is China and Japan. They were fairly weak and just kind of getting started in World War One, but I do think it's important. That's kind of like a put a footnote in that one because they're very important in World War Two.
Okay.
Okay, so I have here. I'm going to kind of just go through like a broad outline of historical dates, and I would say just like stop me if you have any questions or I'll kind of like pause in between, I guess, so that people can give people a word in edgewise. Because I don't want to just make a list of historical dates. Otherwise, I'll get through my notes really fast and we won't have anything to talk about.
Okay.
So I have here in 1848, Karl Marx writes the Communist Manifesto. And it's important to note that at this point, I mean, Karl Marx is a German guy. He was living in London. And he is, at that point, Germany did not exist either. It was the same situation as Italy. They were a collection of not city states necessarily, but kind of small fiefdoms. And also, I mean, I really don't want to get all the way back to Napoleonic times, but a lot of the reason that they're so small and broken up depends on Napoleonic stuff. So I won't
I'm
go back.
gonna I'm gonna jump in on you right here.
Yeah.
So one thing to keep in mind about this area of the world is that this is the area of the world where, for the past 5,000 years, all war took place. It has been conquered and reconquered and reconquered and reconquered by all of the big, um, uh, all of the big conquests from history. Napoleon, Alexander the Great, like Rome itself. Like this area has been conquered and reconquered and broken up into bits and pieces forever.
Well, I do
Um,
think that probably the reason it appears that way to you is because we have a big focus on like European history in the U.S. But I mean, like Alexander the Great, that's one example you gave. I mean, he went east. He conquered
yeah,
like
yeah.
almost all the way to India. Like he was conquering Iran. Well, they didn't call it Iran at the time, but like that's where Alexander the Great
But
was.
that's what I'm saying to my point. Like these places didn't exist with the names that we know now because people were just doing that.
Sure.
like just all over the place. People were just doing that. Remember, the entire West wasn't a thing
Right.
unless you were like Native American or South American, right? Like there was no it as far as history is concerned as we know it. We don't know anything about the history going back that far on this side of the world. So the history of wars all happened that we study all happened there.
Right. Right. Well, the people have been calling themselves Alamein, which is one of the names of the tribes that ruled Germany at the end of near the Roman Empire times. So the word German has existed for a long time, and there's been a German people for a long time, but there wasn't a Germany until pretty recently. And 1871 is when the Empire of Germany was founded. And that was founded basically, Prussia decided that they were big enough to kind of, um, I guess, absorb a lot of the other German states. And of course, a lot of people at the time, they wanted this. They kind of saw the US and what was happening in the US and also the UK and France, and seeing those nations doing so like good for their citizens. I mean, maybe bad for the rest of the world, but they saw those nations basically like conquering and bringing home spoils, and they wanted that too. So they thought, well, the only way to do that is if we stop, bickering amongst ourselves about which, German power it should be the one in charge. And I mean, Prussia was pretty strong as well. So that's kind of how Germany came to be. Um, and then I have in here in 1889 the formation of the Second International, which is an alliance between German and French working. So uh, those like the First International was like a group of communist leaders who kind of got together. The Second International, it excluded a lot of the anarchists, and that was, I think, kind of intentionally done because those people, the people were starting to realize, at least the people who attended the Second International, was starting to believe, right, that they needed some kind of state in order to they need to seize some kind of state in order to achieve their goals. And the reason I have this in here is because it leads into what was happening at the beginning of World War II. Sorry, World War One. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, 1889 to 1912, when the SPD, which is the German Social Democratic Party, got 34.8% of the vote and became the largest party in the German parliament. So this is still before World War One, and they were still excluded from government, meaning that they were not uh, like basically the other parties were able to form a coalition that allowed them to be excluded from government. Right, when you have a parliamentary system, you choose which parties, like it's whatever parties can make a big enough coalition to get 50%. That's who gets to elect the prime minister, and nobody wanted to work with the Socialist Party despite the fact that they had 33% of the vote. And then July 28th, 1914, World War One breaks out. So that's 2 years later. So this is still in the context of SPD having, majority of the government. And August 4th, 1914, only a couple days later, despite the Second International having ruled that the members would oppose war between European powers, the SPD and other socialists, the leadership of other socialist parties in Europe, agreed to support their own governments. And this was a move that was kind of like driven by leadership and opposed by most members. And that the reason that I think that's so important is because I kind of see World War One as almost like a multi-country tamp down on the working class movements that were arising at the time. And I'm not saying that it was necessarily like
100%. I agree with you.
right, and I'm not saying that it's necessarily like a conspiracy among like the crown heads of Europe or whatever. Like I'm not trying to say that they agreed together, got together, and were like, how are we going to stop this working class thing? Let's slaughter millions of people, right? I'm not necessarily saying that's what they were doing. I mean, maybe they were, but I think it's more along the lines of they kind of started to individually realize that their interests like needed to kind of take them to war. And to kind of illustrate that, like in that election in 1912, when the SPD got 34.8% of the vote, the Liberal Party, who ended up in charge, like they were really pushing war as a way to get more votes in the election. Like they were spitting out a lot of propaganda about like Russia encroaching on Germany and stuff like that in order to try to get more votes. So I think that there was a lot of that happening. I think that there was a lot of people seeing, working class movements rise up, getting scared, and kind of seeing like they just kind of see naturally, right? That one way to avoid that, or I mean, not necessarily like that they intentionally went to war to avoid it, but like one way to avoid that is war propaganda, just like what's happening today, right? Like with all the anti-China rhetoric, right? It's a way to get people focused on something other than the problems at home.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the reasons why we're in forever wars. It's definitely one of the reasons. And this is proven like especially in our lifetime ever since 9/11. Like the government has just used the excuse of dangers abroad to make sure that there was something bigger happening
Right.
than us need to worry about. And then conveniently when we were no longer at war for the very short period of time that we haven't been at war ever since we were, in high school, COVID happened. And then we
Right.
went right back to war.
Well,
So
I mean, realistically, we were at war. The war in Afghanistan was still going on then.
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
True.
yeah. So yeah, we just never not been at war for
Right,
the past 25 years.
and so that the threads of that reach back through time, and they were happening even at the beginning of World War One, war, or at least like the threat of war as a distraction.
Something I want to cut in on you on here
Oh, sure,
is
go ahead.
literally 100 years before that was the French Revolution,
Right,
and that was really the first big overthrow from like the people, especially speaking of powerful nations in that area, right? I mean,
right,
France was a gigantic power at the
sure,
time. And so for, the people to rise up and fucking guillotine Louis the Sixth and
yeah, Louis the 14th, I think, actually.
yeah, Louis the 14th, I'm sorry. Um, it's and the Marie Antoinette
Yeah,
and all that stuff, like this started even before that. I just
well,
wanted to bring that up, like from a like a people rising up
sure.
because of that kind of rule. Like,
Yeah. And I'm hand waving a lot of this because if I mean ultimately really all of history is like one War I story, right? I mean, and everything's related. So it's you have to start somewhere. And since this is World War II, that's the only reason I chose not to go all the way back to Napoleonic times, because probably if I really wanted to follow it, I mean, you can go further back than that, because I mean you have the French Revolution before that, right? I mean, Napoleon's only part of the French Revolution.
That's something we should have another episode on. It's
Yeah,
just
we
the French
definitely should
Revolution.
talk about the French Revolution and Napoleon. Um, Mike Duncan has a great series on the French Revolution, so anybody who likes podcasts, go listen to that. I mean, it's like 72 episodes long, so have fun. But it's amazing. Um, so, anyways, just to kind of highlight like how important the working class and like working class politics are to like the beginning of World War One. In January 1918, before World War One was even over, 1 million workers across Germany go on strike all at once. So that that alone probably has some effect on the fact that in November of that year, World War One is over, and Germany is one of the losers. Right? Not to say that they did that on purpose to make their country lose, but I mean, so many people were dying in the war, right? That a lot of low level workers wanted it to end and never really wanted it to start in the first place. I mean, the Second International ruled that there shouldn't be war between European powers, and that the Socialist Party should oppose that, but the leadership kind of betrayed them and decided to support the government.
Quick interject. There something happened in Russia at the exact same time.
That's
Are you
correct.
planning
Yeah, I
on?
have Russia
Okay.
in the same category because it's very important. Like what happens in Russia is also very important. In 1917 is the Russian Revolution, right? So we missed that step, and the Russian and German revolutions are very related, but I just kind of grouped them into um, to focus on Germany and then come back to Russia. Basically.
Okay.
That's why I put these two together. So, anyways, November 11th, 1918, World War One is over. And March 3rd, 1918, I missed that one. March 3rd, 1918, Russia signs a separate peace with the Central Powers, mainly Germany, right? Because Germany was really where the war was being fought with Russia. And then in early November 1918, even before the end of World War One, some people say the German Revolution happened, right? So like literally right after World War One, or right even right before the end, the old government's deposed, and the SPD comes into power. So now a socialist party, the one that sided with the government, is ruling Germany. And in January 1919, so that only a couple months after that, some more radical communists revolt against the SPD-led German government. That's called the Spartacus Uprising. So it has one of the most badass names in history, I'd say. And so what happens there is that the SPD, who's in power, they work with the right-wing Freikorps, which is like a militia of World War One veterans, to violently put down the left-wing revolution against them and execute the leaders. Rosa Luxemburg, if you've ever heard of her name, she died. She was killed because of her participation in that revolution. And then January 1923 is the first attempted Nazi coup. And so what I'm trying to say here is kind of paint a picture, right? There's a direct thread between the Socialist Party's cooperation with that right-wing militia and the Nazi overthrow of the German government and the eventual ending of their republic and the Third Reich.
Yeah, I think one of the big key things to mention here is one of the big things that allowed Hitler's rise to power during that period was his anger at the SPD for signing the treaty
Right.
and going along with the punishments that would come down on them. because the country was left completely impoverished, and like there was just starving people everywhere essentially.
Sure.
And so that's really where he got his stump from,
Right.
and where that started.
Germany was forced to sign an extremely punitive treaty, where they had to make an indemnity payment to France for some absurd number of francs, and that was part of what caused Hitler's rise to power. That's part of what caused hyperinflation in Germany. And I mean, none of that stuff can be removed from the reasons that World War II happened. But I mean, I just wanted to highlight the fact that what happened internally um, kind of led to it too.
Yeah, for sure.
So you guys want to jump into Russia?
Yeah, buddy.
Okay.
Let's do it.
So Russia, I don't have a lot of history before before 1917, the Russian Revolution. I didn't write down anything that happened at the beginning of World War One, and the reason I kind of omitted that stuff is because I don't see it as all that important. The context that Russia was in leading up to the revolution is that they had a very weak state, because like they were an empire, they were a large empire, but it was also like it had very, very low centralization. They basically let a bunch of dukes and then counts and then whatever they called the titles, I don't know, but they let their nobles kind of run rampant. Um, I mean, maybe they didn't have a choice, but they also they had a lot of problems with enforcing laws and that kind of stuff. Really, even forming the laws to begin with. They barely had a constitution. There was a constitutional crisis. There was even a revolution, I think, in like 1909 or something like that failed. So they really were really having not a great time of it. And so they entered World War One, and they tried their best to defend against Germany. Didn't do that great. Had a lot of failures, and that led to, even during the war, right? February 1917. That's still during the war. There's a revolution to overthrow the Tsar, and that one is successful.
Yeah, yeah. Nicholas decided to go to war with Japan, and they lost terribly.
Right.
And that's one of the many reasons, outside of all the civil unrest and everything else that was going on, that led to that takeover.
Right. That was during 1904 and 1905, and so that kind of triggered the very first like Russian attempted revolution. Is seeing how bad the military got wrecked by Japan. I mean,
Yeah, that's
also people were
Sunday, Bloody Sunday.
yeah, people were very racist too in general, and they just kind of like were like, "Wow, we just got our asses kicked by insert racial slur here for Japanese people." And I mean, they basically saw Asians as backwards, and so they were very surprised, and it allowed people to kind of see the Russian state for what it is, which was very weak. Yeah, so that's 1904, 1905. Yeah, thanks for providing that. I think that is important to kind of set the context for how it played out. But
I'm
yeah,
with you. I got your back.
so yeah, February 1917 is the revolution to overthrow the Tsar, and that one is actually a liberal revolution. They don't kill the Tsar right away. They kind of just put him under lock and key, his family under lock and key, whatever. They also form like different governments. They basically become a republic.
This is also the disappearance of, and where the story of Anastasia comes from.
Correct. Yeah, that's a little later on when the communists come to power, though, because they're the ones who actually killed the Tsar and his family.
Yep.
So in November 7th, 1917, is the communist revolution to overthrow the liberal government, and the beginning of what's called the Russian Civil War. So the Germans, interestingly enough, actually made a decision to send Vladimir Lenin back to Russia. That was a decision that the German government took for prudence in World War One, like to have a better time in World War One. They said, okay, let's send this guy back to Russia so he can destabilize their government, and he did. So they were successful in overthrowing the government, and in March 3rd, 1918, Russia surrendered to Germany. I already mentioned that one, but it's very significant. I mean, that didn't happen very long after the communists, came to power, and at the beginning of their time in power, they weren't very strong. I mean, we only say that they came to power on November 7th, 1917, because that's when the revolution started. But really, it went all the way through, like the 1920s with the Russian Civil War. And so, at the time, the communists were extremely weak, and so they decided to surrender to Germany, kind of as like there's not really much of a point in fighting me type deal.
A stabilization effort.
Exactly. And everybody believed at the time, including all the way back to Karl Marx, everybody believed that Germany was going to be the first real revolution. Even after the Russian Revolution was successful and the communists came to power, they still believed that Germany was going to be the first real one. And the reason for that is because Germany actually had a strong capitalist system. And I mean, the way that Marx predicted things would happen is that the places where the capitalist system was the strongest would actually evolve into communism. That was his prediction. Now, I mean, that hasn't been bared out by history, really. But that is what everybody at the time believed. All the communists did.
Very interesting.
So basically, part of Russia's surrender to Germany was the fact that they thought that, well, we're surrendering and getting extremely bad terms. They got terrible terms from Germany. They were thinking like, well, we're surrendering to a government that's not going to be around much longer. I mean, and they're right? Because there was a German Revolution too, but it's also the case that they didn't, they thought that was going to be more that the Germans were going to turn around and kind of lead the global communism, and that they weren't really going to have to worry about it.
So once the German government did collapse, did that cancel out all the stuff that they had to pay, that the Russians had to pay them?
So the
Or
Russians didn't really have to pay anything. I mean, maybe they did. I don't know. But they mostly surrendered a treaty. They mostly surrendered on a treaty that had really bad terms as far as them losing territory. Germany
Oh,
wanted to create a
okay.
bunch of buffer states in between them and Russia. And so, like, Finland becomes independent at this point, Estonia, a lot of Poland, Ukraine. Ukraine was independent at the end of World War One. And so, essentially, the story of the Russian Civil War, and I have it in here as the next thing in my notes, like in the 1920s, in 1920 is really when it starts turning around for the communists and they start actually winning. And at that point, they start reconquering territory that became independent as part of their treaty with Germany. So that's the part where they like reconquer Ukraine. They, make Estonia into a Soviet republic, like that kind of stuff.
Gotcha.
How it was taught, and this is where I know we're going to have a separate conversation about some of this stuff, but so there's things going on with Russia and Ukraine right now, obviously.
Right.
And this is kind of where that the friction starts, because what happens is Ukraine becomes, from how I was taught the history, is that Ukraine actually became quite powerful on its own and was actually quite a bit more powerful than Russia was. However, we're getting into the start of the formation of the Soviet Union,
Right.
where the Ukraine was essentially pressured into this because they didn't want to give up their own government, their own governing power over themselves. They had a really hard time with that.
Right.
And they were pressured really hard to join the Soviet Union.
Well, they were
So-
also pressured through military force.
and through military force. So
Right.
when we're looking at what's happening now, this is something to think back on.
Sure. Yes.
Because there's this conflict has happened ever since Russia, like Ukraine was its own state, then Russia took it over, and then it was its own state again. And
Sure.
like so when you're thinking about this, that's important to know. And I just
Well,
thought
and it
that
was
important
also
to say.
before that, it was part of Russia because as part
Yeah.
of the treaty, it
Yeah.
became free. I mean, it's really a complicated history for sure. And also, what I think what you're talking about with Ukraine becoming so powerful, like during the Civil War, the White Army, who was fighting the Red Army, right? The Red Army was the communists. The White Army is the other side, basically, right? They essentially retreated to the territories that Germany had freed because those like they had legitimate governments who were ruling them, right? So they could kind of be like, well, now we're going to fight to keep Ukraine independent from Russia, right? So like they as they kind of realized that what was legally Russia itself was a lost cause, they kind of retreated to the fringes. And there was a lot of fighting in Siberia. There was a lot of fighting in Ukraine. There was a lot of fighting in Poland. And that's the kind of the story of the Russian Civil War.
For a good chunk of this conversation, I was only really thinking of countries as like groups of people and not really thinking about it in the like land sense. It wasn't really until the Russia Germany part just then that the amount of land that we're talking about here is really significant.
Sure. Yeah.
We're talking about vast swaths of land.
Yeah, like majority of Europe kind of significant, and
Yeah.
I don't know why, like when I think about war and stuff, I don't think about that. But I mean, obviously that comes with like resources and
Sure.
places for people to fucking live. So I mean, I guess I don't know. That was like something that clicked in my head that maybe has never really clicked in my head before. So.
Well, Ukraine is today. I mean, I don't know exactly what their territory was like back then, but today, I mean, I this is off Wikipedia, so it may have changed a little bit with the Ukrainian war. They are the 45th largest country on Earth. I mean, and that was part of Russia. So, I mean, that gives you some idea of how huge Russia is.
Yeah, and they are a mineral rich area. They
Yes.
they very much are, especially with and especially with farmland, which is really important in that area because of the fucking cold and
Right.
how hard it is to grow food. So.
Right. They're on the south west side of Russia, and they border a sea, and so that makes it a very attractive place to grow a lot of grain. And so that was one of the main reasons why Russia wanted it back, why the Soviets thought it was important.
So that's why they took Crimea in particular, because that is right there on the sea, right?
That's why they wanted to take Crimea from. That's part of the reason they want to take Crimea from Ukraine back in 2014 or whatever.
Uh-huh.
It's also a very important militarily because it's a port.
Sure. Yep. And actually, the why Ukraine had Crimea in the first place, like that goes back to internal Soviet politics. So it's like it's a whole thing. But this isn't even a podcast episode about the Ukraine war. I'm sure we could do a fun one on that. But anyways, at the end of my notes here, I have January 1924. Lenin dies and Stalin comes to power. So it's kind of just to give you guys some context. Stalin has been in power about 10 years when World War II starts, right? And he spends that time purging a lot of people, like imprisoning them, removing them from government. A lot of instability in the sense of people didn't really know where they stood. Like that was kind of the instability they were dealing with. Effectively, what the Soviets ended up having to do was they kind of started to realize, I mean, by 1924, right, that the German Revolution just wasn't going to happen, right? Because 1924, that's after that first Nazi coup that ends with Hitler in prison, right? And I mean, maybe they don't know that Hitler's going to become the leader of Germany. They probably aren't psychic, right? But they can kind of see the writing on the wall of the fact that Germany's not coming to save the day. And so a lot of what Stalin did, I mean, the crimes he committed were effectively Soviet. The Soviets kind of realized that um, they were going to have to do capitalism before they could do communism. So Russia was like a republic, a medieval kingdom, right, or empire, with a bunch of peasants. Like most people there were peasants, and the Soviets realized that in order to reach communism, they were first going to have to turn those peasants into workers because you need workers for communism, right? And so the great purges and all that stuff that Stalin did, like the purpose of it, whether it's right or wrong, the purpose was to um, to forcibly turn those peasants into workers.
I did not know that.
So
Yeah.
something I want to say, real quick. So I just did a history check here. So this is Stalin before World War II, according to his policies. Okay, so the one thing that Rab mentioned is all the political people, right, that he took out when he became um, when he kind of took over. And that's actually has a name, and it's called the Great Purge.
Right.
And it ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million people.
Right.
Wow.
And the second one is the Ukrainian famine. Okay, so this is a man-made famine that led to the deaths of millions of Ukrainians, somewhere in between 3 to 7 million people.
Wow.
He then had Gulag labor camps, which Rav just mentioned. Millions of people were sent to gulags, and they don't know the exact numbers of people that were killed by that, but I mean we're talking, once again, we're talking millions. There was also uh, uh, Cossacks, right? So there was the decossacization and deportations of ethnic minorities. So this is literally millions of people again. Um, Total estimates give him 6 to 9 million people. This is before World War II, and some estimates are even higher. But one thing to keep in mind is Stalin. I believe the correct number is he tripled the amount of deaths in total over his people than Hitler did. Like this is like he tripled the numbers.
Yeah,
Um,
I really don't know. There's a lot of debate about like
the no
what.
about the exact numbers. Yeah, the
Yeah,
exact numbers. There's lots of debates about the exact numbers, but
yeah. So I
but
don't want to get into that too much. But what I kind of want to say is like I think that you can kind of see leading up to World War One and World War Two, like the UK, France, and even Germany, they have capitalist revolutions that happen that turn them into they take them from groups of peasants to capitalists and workers, but those ones got to happen much slower than what the communists were trying to do in Russia. They were basically trying to turn a peasant country into capitalists and workers in 10 years. And so, like, I mean, I don't necessarily think that it was a good idea for Stalin to do all that stuff, but I mean, that was the goal. And it's kind of interesting because, like, as Lenin was dying, there was another current in Russia that basically, like in Russia, or sorry, in Soviet leadership, that kind of said that, like, well, the German Revolution's not going to happen. we did our thing by preventing, and because whenever the November Revolution happened, the communists seizing power was to prevent a extremely anti-Semitic and fascist party from seizing power. So they were kind of like, there was another current apart from Stalin's current that was like, we did our thing. Let's just surrender back to the liberals. Let's give the government back to the liberals and let them do capitalism. So that way the blood will be on their hands. And then the communists can come back once we have capitalism in Russia, right? But Stalin really wanted to stay. I mean, and it kind of makes sense, right? Stalin, the Soviets, they wanted to stay in power, and they saw those purges and all that stuff as the only way to do it.
That is crazy.
Super grim.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's I mean,
super crazy grim.
Very grim.
yeah. I certainly don't. I definitely don't want to make it sound like that stuff is justified any more than Hitler's justified because Germany got a massive indemnity, that they had to pay, right? There's a lot of people doing terrible things for reasons that you kind of understand, I guess. That's more what the story I'm trying to tell.
History, when we speak about this stuff from the side of history, right? We're talking about things that happen. We're not talking about people's like thought processes into how they got to where they were going, right? Like this is this is not a like you're saying, like this is not like we're trying to humanify like these decisions or anything.
Sure.
Like there people made decisions that were very wrong during this period of time. However, there were a lot of things going on.
Right.
And so I mean, we make bad decisions based on very small fucking things that go bad, right? Like imagine trying to come up with solutions to some of these problems. Like they definitely did them in the wrong way, but just imagine having to try to come up with solutions to these problems. It's
Sure.
crazy.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I'm sure that many people. I mean, people in Stalin's position would certainly. Most people, right? If they were put in that position, if they just woke up in that position, they would simply lose, right? They would simply cede power because the forces arrayed against them would be too great, right? And the fact that Stalin was able to hang on to power by doing all this, like that doesn't make it right, but it's like,
it's what happened.
Yeah, he
It's
is the type
just
of
what
person.
happened.
He was the type of person to seize power in the first place, right? He didn't just wake up there, right? He's the type of person who actually, had the drive and motivation and what have you to get there, to stay in power, no matter the cost.
So of course that person's gonna want to stay there.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%.
I mean,
the alternative
it's
is probably
sociopath,
death,
right? Like he's
Yeah.
just a sociopath, right?
Yeah, and the alternative is probably death. Like that's how these things generally work, right?
Sure,
like if
sure.
you're in power, like if you can't stay in power, you're probably just going to get whacked.
Sure.
Like especially during this time frame, like people, they would just walk up on you and you'd be dead. Like so I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, he became incredibly paranoid, like
Yes.
to the point of ridiculousness.
Well, also to the
and
point of
they all do.
He was in part of the Great Purges. He had like he was scared of doctors, and that was a code for Jewish people to some degree, right?
Yeah.
So even Stalin, I mean, like communist hero or whatever, was doing that kind of stuff too. I mean, there's a lot of debate about all that stuff and the numbers and what have you. Like, there's plenty of people who who go online and say Stalin did nothing wrong. That I think is more of that's like a trite summary of it, right? That's kind of trying to say like, how do you like who would what you were saying a second ago, like what would you do in that situation? Like, how would you hang on to power? You definitely wouldn't be able to.
This is like a really, really fucked up trolley scenario, like trolley problem.
Right.
Like you're tied up on the tracks on one side and the train's coming at you. and one person is on the other side, you have a button, you can hit it and it'll kill them instead of you. I think most people just wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And then you go like, okay, well, okay, you're a bad person, but what about if there's two people there? You know? And then all of a sudden, okay, well, what if there's like 35 million people there? Stalin's the person that's like, yeah, I'm gonna hit the button.
And we all know that person, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know that person. They exist for sure.
I mean, if you could go back in time and stop the Russian Revolution, I mean, one of the things, if you stopped it in November 7th, 1917, you basically have the black faction coming to power, which they were fascists who wanted to do purges of Jews in Russia. And if you stopped it in 1924, like if you just killed Stalin right as soon as Lenin was dying, I mean, you probably take out one of the major reasons the Nazis lost. So, like, I mean, I'm not once again really not trying to justify what Stalin did,
Right.
or even say he's a good person, or that the Soviets were good overall. I mean, without him, one way or the other. It's just that there's so many bad things that they did fight. I guess that's one thing you can say.
So, so something I want to point out here real quick. So we talked about the purge, right? We're talking about him trying to cling to power and everything else. And one of the craziest things, because trivia is fun, right? Is that Stalin was known for altering photographs, and this by removing people from photos that were taken in order to completely remove them from history. So he would take photos with people who were in his inner circle and then airbrush them out of the photo after he killed them.
Yeah, that's pretty
That's
wild.
So,
hilarious.
the big one is the most famous example is Nikolai Yezhov. He was the head of the Soviet secret police during the purge, and part of like Stalin's inner circle. Later, Stalin had him arrested and executed, and then airbrushed him out of an official photograph that would stay in his office, but had him airbrushed out to make sure that he was like essentially erased from history as
That
his
didn't
part
work.
in it. Yeah, it didn't work, but it's bananas.
Yeah, that's really funny. Like that's kind of like Arrested Development level of funny. When you think
Yeah,
about it.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's bananas funny. It's like if we're doing this podcast, right? If for some reason I got in an argument with Rab and then went through and took all the audio and just removed Rab's part from it.
I'm definitely gonna go through and do a little bit of that in this episode just to make people laugh. I'll just leave dead air too. Yeah, yeah. Then we have the Rab Ultra cut.
So, and while we're on Stalin trivia, I think this is pretty fun. I think he was actually one of the coolest guys before the Russian Revolution because he was not
So cool. Bro,
well.
so
Yeah, unlike the rest of the cadre that kind of did it, like did the revolution, he was not a intellectual. Like a lot of them, Lenin, Trotsky, they were people who were either like high middle class or like low nobility, kind of the same thing, right? They were in that level of economics, and they also had educations, and they did a lot of like arguing in cafes about how the government should be run and stuff. And Stalin was basically just a peasant who, like, he just kind of pulled himself up and was it like he was a gangster basically actually. In one incident in 1907, he was one of the main people who organize a train robbery to fund the revolutionary activities. And they managed to steal 241,000 rubles from a bank stagecoach. And they used bombs and guns to attack police and soldiers who were defending it.
So
shit.
keep that number in mind, that this is the early 1900s. 214,000 rubles.
Yeah, I
is-
wonder what that. I wonder how much that would be like in my brain terms.
Yeah, who knows?
It's a lot of money.
It's millions
Like,
for sure.
Yeah, like it's a lot of money.
Yeah,
Okay.
and that was before money was digital, so they couldn't just be like, well, chargeback. They actually got away with the coins, and
Right.
maybe not even notes at that point, right? Because I mean that was 1907. The Russian government at that point was the Tsardom. So like at that point they were probably still just issuing coins, and they
Right.
probably barely had banknotes.
So
Wow,
something
that's
funny.
crazy.
So your mind is really interesting when you're a child, right? Like the things you imagine that things are, and just your imagination is a wild place when you're a child. And when I was a child and I heard rupees
Rubles?
as like currency or ruples,
Well, rupees is the currency of India.
yeah, rubles. I'm sorry. And when I heard that, I heard gems like rubies.
Yeah,
Like that's what I
for sure.
imagined their currency was like tiny little gems.
Yeah, and that if you went like mining and you found gems,
Yeah,
you just had a shitload of money
yeah, that's what I
Yeah.
thought was going on
for sure.
until
I'm right there with you.
probably high school. That's what I thought. So this is at least a decade of my life.
I was hoping you were going to say until last year.
No,
It might have been until just now. No,
Just
no.
now.
yeah, just until just now, I thought that they were just passing around little shiny red stones.
Gems, little precious stones.
In Russia, they still trade in shells.
Wow, it's just a different culture, you know.
I thought it was oil, but that's just me.
Well, do you guys want to talk about China and Japan? I have much less notes on them than even them combined than Russia or Germany. And I was hoping to get through it because it's definitely not important to be its
Yep.
own episode. Okay.
Let's do it.
The kind of the important part is that China had just overthrew their monarchy, and they had gone through a long period of instability as well. I mean, there's a lot we can get into with like the Opium Wars and stuff like that. With the UK, but effectively, right? China was in a very weak and unstable position at the beginning of World War One. And Japan was freshly an empire, right? Looking outwards and trying to like prove itself on the world stage. And so Japan actually fought on the side of the Allies. And the reason they did that is because they saw the Germans as weak and wanted to seize their holdings. And Germany happened to control a decent amount of land in territorial China as well. They kind of had like the equivalent of French Vietnam, except they had like a Chinese version of that, right? Where they had colonized a large, not large compared to China itself, but a large portion of land there, right? And Japan wanted to seize all of that.
Now, would this be in mainland China, or are we talking about like island territory?
No, mainland China. So like Germany actually had a colony there. I think it was like a lease situation where China had leased it to them. I guess. There's one called the Piachu Bay leased territory.
Was it Hong Kong? Because Hong Kong's been passed from country to country to country over the past like 200 years. So
yeah, they wanted to. It's Hong Kong had was Great Britain, right? And so Germany kind of wanted to copy them. And actually, a lot of what World War One and World War Two is kind of about too is the fact that Germany and Italy and Japan they saw the big powers, right? And they wanted that. So, Germany was before World War One even trying to basically copy the UK and France and seized territory in Asia. And I was actually wrong. It's not a huge territory. It's only 213 square miles. So, I mean, that's not giant, but it's big enough and it's part of mainland China to, to be attractive to Japan and also to really piss off the Chinese when Japan decided they wanted to hold on to it. Um, Spoiler alert: they did not hold on to it. The treaty that they signed at the end of World War One even did not give them that territory, but it did let them take a lot of the German holdings and really set the stage for Japan as an empire rather than just as a nation. And that's about all I have. I kind of see that what's happening in Asia as important for setting the seeds for World War II. I mean, Asian history, obviously, the history of China is very, very long. The history of Japan's pretty long. And I, to be quite honest, know less about it than the history of, Western countries, I guess, broadly, right?
I know a
But
little bit. I know a little bit more about that side.
sure. Maybe you can fill in some details too, but I guess I want to touch on it because I know more about those countries in World War II than I do about pre-World War II, right? And so I kind of want to just give context because eventually we're going to come back to them and talk about what happened in World War II in Asia. And so setting the stage with what's happening in China and Japan. Japan seizing European holdings, China being very weak, and just strong enough to where they could say like, no, you can't take land that's literally part of mainland China. But ceding to a lot of Japanese demands, and that's kind of like how that goes into World War II very well because I mean World War II in Asia is mostly a war between China and Japan.
Yeah, and it's a pretty crazy one too.
Yeah, for sure. There's lots of interesting there.
So, I mean, trying to, just as a note, since we're nearing the end here, just as a note, all of these wars and problems that are going on right now are just continuations of the things that have been going on for the past 100 to 200 years.
Surely.
So Russian Ukraine, and we could even, I mean, literally every tiny war that's going on right now is
All the stuff
because
in the Middle East dates back to
yep
to hundreds of years ago with colonization and what have you.
the Middle East stuff, and China's posturing over Hong Kong. um like this stuff is not new. The only thing that's new is the people that are involved, and it's crazy. It's crazy, but that's kind of why you know the saying of history will repeat itself kind of comes from,
Sure.
is like this stuff does not go away. um and nobody really knows the best way to fix the problems. um
Right.
and
And
that's
I
where
think
I'm
that
gonna leave that.
the one reason it's important to study history, I mean, it's not necessarily so that you can learn from your past mistakes, because, I mean, what the fuck am I supposed to do about Russia and Ukraine, right? I mean, I can't
Oh, for
help
sure.
that situation at all. Me knowing about it is not going to help. Um, so, I mean, but I think if you're here, if you're listening and you got to the end of the episode, you at least have some innate sense that knowing about this stuff matters. And I think that trying to understand what the people were doing, what kind of decisions they were making, that still helps you in some way today, right? Even
It
if you're
will.
not in a position of power.
Yeah, it just goes back to context is extremely important. From the small things to the big things, context is very important. And if you're not paying attention to the context behind things, the only thing you are is misinformed. And I think one of the reasons why we like doing, especially stuff like this with, going over the wars and the things that we talk about, is to get that context to you. Um and as per always our disclaimer, we don't always know. We may not say the exact thing. We may fuck up a fact. We
Sure.
may, whatever the case is, but we're earnest in trying to give you context, if not the overall 100% correct fact.
Very true. Yeah, let us know in the comments where we messed up, because we inevitably did. And I want to hear about it. Please email me. I think I'm rab@thepandapod.com. And if not, you can email thepandapod@gmail.com or podcast@thepandapod.com and send your complaints there, and they'll get forwarded to the appropriate party. Well, I think that's been everything. It's been fun talking to you guys about this.
Yeah, I feel well informed once again. Every time we do one of these history episodes, I'm like, I know nothing.
I mean, that doesn't surprise any of us, but
Wow, Jesus, you really went for it. Yeah, they know plenty of things. Not all of us are history smart like Rab, but it is interesting, and I look forward to hearing more the next time. I don't know much outside of like our own history, and that makes me feel really, really dumb. So
I don't feel like I even know my own history. So,
Well, you didn't know about the War of 1812 or the Mexican-American War.
what do you expect when he got a circle on his test?
I thought a circle was a good grade.
Who knows?
at least it wasn't a square. Yeah.
Well, we will all circle back to this topic one day after some intermissions. I'm sure people want to hear about other things besides just what Stalin was thinking. So let's move on to new topics, and I'll talk to you all next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
thank you. Bye.